All right, so 6.2, we are going to get into some specifics about a type of quadrilateral called a parallelogram. So a parallelogram is just a quadrilateral, so still four sides, with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. So if you see these arrows, that's telling us that, right, opposite sides. So this side is parallel to this side, and this side is parallel to this side. Okay, so that is a parallelogram. The length of the sides don't quite matter. We'll get into what's specific about those, but the really important thing is that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Okay, and just recall that we talked about, right, what we mean by opposite sides and opposite angles. We talked about that in our last video in 6.1. So AB and CD are opposite sides. A and C are opposite angles. We're going to be using that a lot going forward, so just make sure you understand what that means. Okay, so properties of parallelograms. I know there's kind of a lot on the screen, but let's dig into it, right? So first one, opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. So A is going to be congruent to C. You can see those congruent marks there, right? B is going to be congruent to D, okay? So opposite angles are congruent. Same thing with opposite sides. So AB is congruent to DC. That's what this is telling us. And BC is congruent to AD there. Okay, now here's a big one. Consecutive, which again, we just said that consecutive really just means next to. Angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. So supplementary, oops, let me highlight that. We talked about that a way back. Remember, that means they add up to 180 degrees. So angle A plus angle D has to be 180 degrees. Same if I said angle A plus angle B, those would be right next to each other. They have to add up to 180 degrees. I could do that with B and C. I could do that with C and D as well. I just highlighted two examples there for you. Okay, so opposite angles are congruent, opposite sides are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary. There's the three big things with parallelograms. Last thing, in terms of the diagonals, so again, we kind of discussed this briefly in our quadrilaterals video. Diagonals connect opposite vertices. So we have two diagonals here, and if you look at what this is saying, the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. Okay, we talked about, again, this has been a ways back, but bisect means to split into two equal parts. Right, so if we, let me erase my picture here. If I look at this, right, hopefully you see these congruent marks, so that ED is the same as EB, AE is the same as EC. Okay, what this is not saying is that the entire diagonal, so I'm not saying that AC is congruent to BD, right? That is not true necessarily. Okay, but each part of the diagonal, of the same diagonal, it is split into two equal parts. So those parts would be congruent. Okay, so again, important properties to know. We're going to talk about these a lot going forward. Opposite angles are congruent, opposite sides are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and then the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so let's look at just a couple quick examples. We're going to find each missing side and angle measure. So first thing to think about, opposite sides, opposite angles are congruent. So if AD is 9, BC also has to be 9, right? If DC is 12, AB also has to be 12, okay? Opposite sides are congruent. Same for opposite angles. So if I look at 140, A has to be 140 also. Now, I don't know anything about these angles. Nothing is marked, except we talked about consecutive angles, right? So the angles that are next to each other have to be supplementary. So the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C have to equal 180 degrees. Well, if this is 140, right? What's 180 if I take away 140? Okay, so the measure of angle B is 40 degrees, which makes angle D, because it's opposite, 40 degrees. Okay, when you guys do this in the future, you don't necessarily have to write out all this work. I just wanted to show you my thinking process there. Okay, so again, opposite sides are the same, opposite angles are the same, and then consecutive angles are supplementary. That's what we used here. Okay, now this one is a little bit trickier just because there isn't a picture, but it's giving us this, right, D, E, F, G. So let's just draw our own picture. It doesn't matter how perfect it is. My picture is not very good, but it's enough to help us label. Now, when we label, wherever we start, we have to go either clockwise or counterclockwise. We can't skip any, right? So we can't go D, oops. We can't say D, E, F, G, because that's not going clockwise or counterclockwise, okay? We can't do it that way. So just be careful when you're drawing a picture that you are labeling things correctly. All right, so it's telling us some information. DE is 70, let's label that. EF is 45, let's label that. And then angle G is 68, and we'll label that. So now we're really in the same situation that we were in the last example. All right, it says to find GF. Well, that has to be the same as DE because those are opposite, so that would be 70. Not degrees. Oops, that's my bad. I should change. That should not be. Whoops. That should not have a degree symbol there. Okay. Sides do not have degrees, only angles. Okay, so DG, well, that's the same. No, oops, I made this too small. This is the same as this, right? So DG is just going to be 45. The measure of angle E, that's opposite G, so that should be 68. And then the measure of angle F, right? Well, these are consecutive. G and F together have to equal 180 degrees, right? So 180 minus 68 is going to be 112. Okay, so again, it didn't give us a picture, but drawing it and labeling it is going to help us visually see what's going on. So I always suggest that when you can. All right, now we have to do a little algebra, but this is pretty straightforward, right? Here's A, it's what I'm looking for. This is an angle, this is an angle. If we notice, those angles are opposite of each other, and opposite angles are congruent. So all I need to do is write 6A plus 10 equals 130 and solve that. So subtract 10, divide by 6, so A is 20. And it didn't ask us to plug it back in. It says find the value of the variable. So we did that. We are done. Okay, so again, more to come in class. Hopefully this gave you a good overview of parallelograms, and we will get some more practice together.